Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give this a few seconds to let everybody get settled in who's just joining us. Okay, I think we are looking good. Thank you all for coming today on this lovely Tuesday. I'm Kevin Smith, a member of the Denver Commission on Cultural Affairs, and we are happy to have you join us for our virtual event, Imagine 2020 Speaker Series, Web Accessibility 101. We were scheduled to hold this speaker series earlier in the year, but ended up needing to reschedule. Due to COVID-19, we are now holding this in a virtual format. So thank you all for your flexibility and for pivoting with us. Web accessibility is more important in today's new normal than it ever was. Let's go to the next slide. Today's speaker series shares the same goals as our other speaker series events. Continue the conversations that began with Imagine 2020. Keep the cultural plan at the forefront of our thinking as a community. Inspire implementation by all our cultural partners and learning together. Before we get started with our program this morning, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. We know that you're all a very connected group, so please feel free to share any surprising or interesting information, that you learned today. We love to see ourselves on Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, and if you are so inclined to post, please use hashtag Imagine2020. Today is part 1 of our web accessibility training. We hope you will also consider joining us for part 2 next week. But first, we have a new Imagine 2020 speaker series coming up next Monday, August 3rd, How to be an Anti-Racist Organization. This will be a virtual event with Denver Arts and Venues, the Von V. Stanton Foundation, and the Equity Project LLC to discuss the necessary work organizations must commit to in order to be anti-racist. The conversation will be framed around what organizations can do to take action with regards to race and social justice. Then on Tuesday, August 4th, will be part 2 of the Web Accessibility Series. In this webinar, attendees will further develop their accessibility knowledge by learning the basics of managing an accessible website. This includes gathering institutional support, selecting vendors that can ensure accessibility, onboarding other team members to accessibility, content entry, and monitoring accessibility over time. Note, you do not need to have attended part 1 in order to attend part 2. You can find details about these events and registration links by viewing the calendar on artsandvenues.com. Today's session focuses on our Imagine 2020 vision element, accessibility, achieving access and inclusivity to arts, culture, and creativity. I'm particularly thrilled that we will be talking about digital accessibility today. In my work as the Director of Marketing and Partnerships Director at Denver Film, I'm always looking at ways in which we can remove any barriers to participation and be more inclusive. Accessibility has been a major focus for us, and we are continuously learning about the needs of different communities and working to bring accessible solutions through our programming. This transition into a virtual world for us has opened an opportunity to bring more people together through virtual film programs and by thinking about our programs through the lens of accessibility. Roughly 10% of people have a disability that directly impacts their use of digital technologies, and lawsuits against inaccessible websites are becoming more and more common. The Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 508 require us to provide accessible technology and communication for people with disabilities, but the process of creating and maintaining accessible digital communications can be very overwhelming. This learning is not just about being compliant, but about providing equitable access to our work and offerings. The work is about creating accessible and inclusive opportunities for all. Here to help us is Fen Slattery, accessibility lead at Clique Studios, where they build beautiful things and work towards a more inclusive digital world. As a web engineer, Fen seamlessly translates the needs of users into digital experiences that minimize barriers to access. Welcome, Fen, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks so much for that great introduction, Kevin.
You're welcome.
Let me get my slides up. Hey, there we go. There we got some slides. Hey, everyone. So I'm excited to walk us through Web Accessibility 101. Some quick notes before we start. If you're on a desktop or laptop, which I'm presuming maybe a lot of you are, on the right-hand sidebar there, whichever way it flips me, on the right, there is a chat bar that you can use as we're talking. Looks like somebody already asked the great question of, is there going to be a recording of this? So you can see a live chat there. Also on that right-hand side, we're going to be using a few times the poll feature. So get ready. You'll see some poll questions there for things I want answers to. In general, too, as we go throughout, there will be a lot of times for questions. But if you have a question or a thought to share, just go ahead and share it in the chat. Something that's awesome about us doing this remotely is it's a lot easier for you to give feedback to me as we go along, as opposed to just if we were in person. So all that said, let's get started. I'll be brief about explaining myself since Kevin already did a lot of that for you. I'm Fen Slattery. My pronouns are they, them. Like he mentioned, I'm the accessibility lead at Clique. Part of that, or a large part of that work rather, is specifically helping a wide variety of different kinds of organizations to make their website accessible. Everything from Big 10 schools, international fast food chains, down to little local law firms. So I have a wide variety of experience with implementing accessibility. It's also my job to train our team internally and do external work with lovely folks like all of you today. I'm also a member of the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, from which I have my CPACC certification. That's a Certified Professional in Accessibility Core Competencies. You can tell I was worried about getting that acronym wrong. I'm also a co-organizer of one of the largest digital accessibility meetups in the world, based in Chicago, the Digital Accessibility and Inclusive Design of Chicago meetup. Phew. Now that I've rattled off all these lists of things about me, I want to know a little bit more about you. Just as a note, our agenda for today, generally, we're going to be talking about what the heck accessibility is, then what is disability, how do people with disabilities use the web, why would you make a website accessible, and then how do we know if a website is accessible? So keep an eye out for these agenda slides as we move along. But okay, back to my question. I want to know a little bit more about who's here. So like I said, there's that little chat and poll sidebar to the right. I'm going to start a poll that you should see now. I'm interested to know what your role is, whether that's professionally or what you're aspiring to do. I gave you some options of maybe you work in marketing or design or project management or something else. Maybe like me, you're an engineer who does accessibility work. If your answer is something else, go ahead and put it in the chat for me. Ooh, there's a lot of something else's. I'm excited to learn about all the different interesting things y'all do. Let's see. Event planning, that Kevin. Nice. That should have been an option, I guess, huh? Let's see. It looks like we have 30 folks in here so far who do marketing, about what I expected. 7 designers. Hey, design folks. Oh, some lovely project managers, 8 of you, and a lot of folks who do something else, which sounds very exciting. SEO, program director, program and membership coordinator, museum education, fundraising, program specialist, learning design, guest services, ticketing. You've now learned the lesson that you can type anything and I'll read it out loud, I guess. Marketing and web content, development and event. Oh, lots of event management. That's really neat. Visitor service and education. It sounds like I'm getting a lot of titles that make me assume that y'all do nonprofit work or government work, which is awesome. An artistic director. Okay, cool. This gives me a really good sense of who's here. I super appreciate it. All right, love it. The other thing I want to know, let's see, I asked you what your role is. I'm also interested to know if you have built something with accessibility in mind, whether that's, you manage the project, or you designed something, or you wrote the content, or, whatever. Have you been involved in a project that involved accessibility? I added a poll over there for you. The options I gave you are, yes, all the time I build things with accessibility in mind. Yes, I've done it a few times. Not yet, but I will be soon. Or no, not at all. I haven't ever. And this could be either something digital or something physical. Maybe you've thought about the physical accessibility of an event you've planned, whatever it might be. Okay, waiting for answers to roll on in. We had 50 something for the first one. So, okay, it looks like about a quarter of you, all the time, you are building things with accessibility in mind. You're my people. Thank you. About half of you have maybe a few times done something accessibly. Ooh, and then the other third or so haven't, and some of you will be soon. That's awesome. Oh, this is great. This is a really excellent mix of folks. For those of you who said not yet, but I will be soon, you are in the right place. Good job. And nope, well, hopefully you'll have an opportunity to use these things you learn. And to the folks who said yes, I'm excited to give you some additional knowledge. Love it. Okay. So it looks like we have a wide variety of experience with accessibility and lots of different roles that we do professionally. So that's really awesome. Keep that in mind as we go forward. So the last question I have for you, for me to get a background on where you all are coming from, is go ahead and answer in the chat. I want to know what comes to mind for you when you think about accessibility. Whether that's, I don't even know what the word accessibility means. Or maybe it's, I make sure our events are wheelchair accessible, or whatever it is. What comes to mind when you think about accessibility? Go ahead and answer in the chat for me. Someone says they do accessible artwork. Someone said no experience. Equal access, physical accessibility. Very cool. Ooh, removing barriers to entry. That's a really excellent thing. Not leaving anyone out. Cognitive sensitivity to attendees. Physical access. Ease for everyone. Oh, I like that. That's a good way to put it. Everyone feels welcome. Lots of removing barriers, no barriers. That's a really succinct way to put accessibility. Easy to use, easy to get to, easy to use. Design that considers all abilities. Love it. I'll let one or two more responses and we'll keep going. Ensuring everyone is able to have the same experience. Here we go. Someone says, WCAG, ARIA, equal access. I bet you're a person who does a lot of accessibility work. We're going to learn what those acronyms mean in a bit. Websites and documents that work with assistive tech. Awesome. That's so many excellent things. Oh my gosh. Okay. Yay, WCAG, someone says. Excellent. I love it. We're going to learn about the WCAG and a bit. That's a great thing to have come to mind. All right, cool. Let's keep moving. So let's start off. What the heck is accessibility? What is accessibility? So my definition, accessibility is the design of products, environments, or services for people with disabilities. It's also, as actually a lot of you said, it's the removal of barriers that prevent access to or interaction with some kind of service. So it's both designing things so that way they don't have a barrier, and then if there is a barrier in place, removing it. Accessibility is also all about inclusion. A lot of you said things like that. Everyone feels included. Awesome. And web accessibility, unsurprisingly, is about applying those principles and methodology of accessibility to the web, to making websites. Unfortunately, as some of you might be aware, accessibility is rarely a priority in digital work, especially on the web. Those of you that said, yes, all the time I do accessible work. If you are doing that with websites, you're in a very small minority along with me. As of February of this year, about 98% of the 1 million most popular websites worldwide had a significant accessibility failure on their homepage. Pause for effect. WebAIM is an organization that does a lot of great accessibility educational work, and they do a survey once a year where they automatically test out the 1 million most popular websites. And this year they found out, as always, the vast majority of them have really big accessibility issues. So when I say that thinking about accessibility in the digital world is uncommon, I mean it. In addition to these huge amount of accessibility issues we see on the web, lawsuits against inaccessible websites are becoming more and more common, and we'll dive into that a lot more later. So clearly, there is a trend of inaccessible websites. Heck, I wouldn't even say it's a trend, it's the norm. It's been the norm for quite a while. How can we, those of us here, break that trend of making inaccessible websites? We'll find out. A good first step is coming to this webinar. So I'm going to pause really quick and ask what questions you have in general about what accessibility is. As a reminder, we're going to dive in a lot about what is disability, how do we know if things are accessible, but the general thought processes behind making things accessible to people with disabilities. And it's okay if you don't have questions. We just want to make sure we're leaving lots of space. Leave a minute or two. Oh, that's so nice of you, Carlene. I'm enjoying your presentation style. I'm enjoying your chat style, Carlene. That's okay if there's no questions. And if you think of one later, add it in. That question was secretly there to make sure I slow down. Okay, so we know vaguely what accessibility is, but in my opinion, to really understand accessibility, you need to understand disability. So let's dive into that. Okay, what is disability? So we can explain this maybe by talking about some numbers. 26% of people in the US, and that number is roughly the same internationally, have some kind of disability. 10% of all people have some kind of disability that significantly impacts how we use technology. I'm one of those people. So that's a lot of folks. The other thing you should know is that disability is much more common in certain populations. These stats are specifically scoped to the US as a note. In the United States, 2 in 5 adults ages 65 or older have a disability. So that's about 40% of people 65 or older have some kind of disability. It's a lot of folks. Also, disability has a significantly higher prevalence along certain racial and ethnic groups. So 2 in 5 non-Hispanic American Indians or Alaskan Natives have some kind of disability, which, as you know, again, that's 40%. That's much higher than the general population. And as I'm sure you can infer from that last stat, disability is a pretty significant axis of marginalization, especially in the United States. Here's some examples. People with a disability are much less likely to complete a bachelor's degree or higher. And these stats, as a note, come from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Also, regardless of what educational level you're at, unemployment rates for people with disabilities are significantly higher than for those without a disability. Disability also intersects with race pretty significantly, as we saw in that previous stat. And this is especially true in regards to unemployment. Unemployment rates for Black disabled Americans compared to white disabled Americans are about double. Really having a marginalized ethnic identity and being marginalized on the basis of disability is like multiplicative. Also, of workers with a disability, 32% of them are employed just part-time, compared to 17% of people without disabilities. So we're much more likely to only be employed part-time. And this is the stat that really gets me. Overall, about 80% of people with a disability are not in the labor force, compared with about 30% of people without a disability. What that means is not in the labor force means you're not employed, but you're also not considered unemployed. To be considered unemployed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you have to be like actively seeking a job, recently lost a job. Those who are considered not in the labor force are not employed and are not seeking employment. So about 30% of adults overall in the United States are not in the labor force, compared to 80% of those of us with disabilities, which is a huge, huge amount of people. Okay, those are impactful. But when we're only considering disability from like an economic standpoint, it kind of implies that the work that someone's value is because of the work they provide or the money they make or the employment they have or don't have. And there are a lot of other ways we can view disability. What are those? So we have a lot of different models of disability. There's about a dozen or so. And if we had, 3 days, we'd go into them all because they're really interesting. But we're just going to highlight the top few that are most commonly seen when we're doing web accessibility work. Oh, this is a really good question. Carlene asked, are those stats mental and physical or only physical? So those are, those count, how do I best explain this? Those Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers are about whether they're mental, physical, cognitive, whatever kind of disability that have a significant impact on one or more basic life functions. So things, like eating, dressing oneself, using the bathroom, remembering, it covers a wide, broad amount of things. But yeah, it can be mental or physical. Good question. And I noticed other folks have some really great questions about barriers that exist within websites, and we will get to that in a bit. Good question. Okay, models of disability. So a common one you will see that folks maybe don't even intentionally think about is the medical model. The medical model of disability says that disability is a problem that a person has, or rather it's a problem and they have it. And that problem has been caused by some kind of trauma or a disease or a health condition, whatever. Under the medical model, the way you approach disability is from an individual standpoint, trying to help that person and ideally cure their disability. And healthcare is the sort of social solution to this. Okay. If we're only thinking about disability from a medical model, it almost seems like, well, you can't use my website. That's your problem. No good. So we might instead consider the social model of disability. When we view disability through this lens, we view disability as a friction between an individual and their environment caused by different social factors. So for example, under the social model, a wheelchair user, right? They are disabled when they are using their wheelchair and trying to access a building that only has stairs, right? There's a friction between them, their needs, and the environment they're in. However, if that building has a ramp or an elevator under the social model, that wheelchair user isn't disabled under those conditions. When you're thinking in the social model, you aim to change social conditions, environments, designs, so that people don't experience that friction. And so they aren't in that way disabled, right? Something you might think about in the social model, those of us that wear glasses, right? Our glasses, without these, I can still see pretty well. But with my glasses, I don't experience friction in not being able to see things, right? I can drive my car just fine. I can read things far away, whatever. And I don't experience friction. So my, what some people might call a disability of poor eyesight isn't a disability because environments and assistive tech exist to help me. Social model. Just a step better in my opinion. I think we can do one better though. So we have the identity model of disability. This agrees that disability is socially constructed. It's the friction between a person and their environment, but also it embraces disability as a positive identity. It's something you have. It's not something that happens to you. It's something to be proud of. Disability isn't something that you need to solve unless the person, wants it solved. Rather, that society is what needs to be solved. So too often in my work, folks will almost swing too far in the direction of the social model and not necessarily actually listen to those of us with disabilities and what needs we have, and instead view things only in a social context. However, when we think in the identity model, you embrace what people are proud of about their identity as being disabled. Yes, somebody said a really great point in the chat. This is, I don't suffer from mental illness. I embrace it as part of me. I love it. That's snaps for that. That's exactly it. It's the idea that what disables me is not my autism. It's the external reactions to me. But my condition isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of. It's who I am. It's how I am, right? Cool. Angela, thank you for saying that. That's great. So if we move forward, sort of thinking of that identity model, that when people have a disability, it's about friction between them and their environment, but also they're the expert on their experience, and there's nothing to be ashamed of about having a disability. We can better understand accessibility. I'm interested to know, though, what questions or thoughts you might have about disability and marginalization, and also maybe if you have questions about statistics of incidents of disability. I think folks had a few when I was talking, so I can scroll back up, but we'll pause for questions right now about disability. The next thing we're going to talk about is different specific examples of disability. So get ready for that. Oh, right, we had the question about, are those stats mental and physical? The other thing I should note about that while y'all are potentially asking questions is that mental and cognitive disabilities are often very much underreported when we're talking about disability statistics. So backing up a little bit to Carlene's question, one could argue it's probably a bit higher because often mental disabilities aren't counted in the numbers that they exist in. Cool. I'm going to assume that folks do not yet have questions about disability, which is totally fine. Okay, so something we can take from that medical model is the individual cause of disability. The idea that disability exists for lots of different reasons. So there are three main types. And again, these are all very useful to understand when you're doing web accessibility work. The first is a permanent disability. So this is some kind of condition you would expect to have for the rest of your life. These can be congenital, you were born that way, or they could be the result of some sort of health issue or condition or some traumatic event like an accident. Examples of a permanent disability are maybe you were born with only one arm, or you are autistic, things like that. They're permanent, they're always with you. The second type of disability is a temporary disability. So these are a condition that you expect to recover from, like an illness or an injury. Maybe you broke your arm, or you have pneumonia and you can't think straight and you're experiencing a lot of fatigue. These are still a condition that's like a part of you, but it's going to go away. The last kind I think is very interesting. It's a situational disability. There's some kind of context that impacts the way you interact with society and your environment, but it isn't always present. So we can view things like being distracted or holding a baby in one arm as a situational disability. Let's think about that a bit more. So let's say there's a context in which you need to, I don't know, lift a heavy box, right? If you have a permanent disability of, for example, only having one arm, you might have to engage with lifting that box very differently. And it might be the exact same way as if you broke your arm, you have a temporary disability, you only have one arm to use to lift that box. And again, that example in a situational disability, if you're holding a baby in one arm, you only have one arm to lift that box. Those people might approach that situation differently and have different, connections to that situation, but functionally, the interaction between them and that box is the same, regardless of whether it's permanent or temporary or situational. Another good example of a situational disability, like I said in here, is maybe you're distracted. Maybe you're in a really loud room. Maybe somebody is speaking a language that you don't understand very well. The way you engage with those situations in those contexts is very similar to somebody with a permanent, or functionally is very similar to somebody with a permanent or temporary disability. And keep that in mind because we're going to carry this idea of a situational disability forward. Okay, cool. So, Fen, I feel like you just said a lot of things about marginalization and numbers and medical models and whatever. Okay, that's cool. But I came to this webinar to know about how people use the internet when they're disabled and how to make my website work for them. Hello, Fen, when are we going to talk about that? Right now. Now that you have the background, we can dive in a lot. Ooh, someone asked, is there any way we can get a copy of your slides with the Bureau of Statistics? Yes, I will absolutely have these slides available for you when we are all done. Great question. And actually, potentially, I can see if somebody can, Jessa, are you able to see if my slides can just be set for people to scroll through them or download them? I don't know. We'll find out. Great question, Madeline. Okay, we were talking about categories of disability. Woohoo! My cute little icons are a little pixelated, but that's okay. Okay, so when we are designing for the web, there are 5 main categories. 5, I should hold that up a little bit higher. There we go. 5 main categories we think about. The first is visual disabilities. So these are things like blindness or low vision. These are also things like color blindness that might limit somebody's ability to distinguish or perceive different colors. They are also things like an oversensitivity to light. So if things are too bright or too high of a contrast, that can, cause pain and difficulty for you. The next category is auditory disabilities. These are things like deafness or being hard of hearing. These are also things like an auditory processing disorder, where you have difficulty distinguishing different sounds, or when an environment is very noisy, you can't really hear much at all. These are also include things like hyperacusis, which is an oversensitivity to sound. A very good question. Is this webinar also available with captions? We should have mentioned this before. Thank you for bringing that up, Carol. So you'll see in the chat, there's a blue box that says for live captioning, please open, and there's a URL. You click just that anywhere in that blue box. And if your audio volume is on, it will open up a live captioning service. That is such a good question. Thank you for asking. I apologize for not mentioning that earlier. Great question. And relevant to auditory disabilities. Good timing. Right. The next category is motor disabilities. So these are both things that impact gross motor abilities, large motions of arms and legs and big movements, right? That also includes fine motor control. So things like, I love being at my own desk, like making the tiny motions to write with a pen, or moving your eyes to look at a specific thing. These can be caused by all sorts of different things, and include things like cerebral palsy, just not having full range of motion in a certain limb. These can also be caused by a lot of different things that kind of bleed into the cognitive category, which is next. Someone asked earlier about different like mental and emotional disabilities. These fall into the cognitive category. This does also include just like neurodivergencies. So under cognitive disabilities, we have things that are like a learning disability, dyslexia, dyscalculia, things like that. We also have autism. We have ADHD. We have, in general, it's a wide family of things, including like mental and emotional health conditions that impact something about the way somebody takes in information, processes it, and remembers it. And the last that's very important for the web is seizure disorders specifically. These are disorders that through different flashing of lights and colors and patterns can induce seizures, which we very much do not want to have happen because of our website. So in general, we have these 5 broad categories. I'll note too that a lot of the times when we're talking about disability, especially on the web, we tend to jump to thinking about these first 2 categories, right? Maybe the easiest ones for a lot of folks to conceive of, right? Oh, you can't see. Got it. Okay, I understand. or you can't hear. Got it. I understand. But it can be a lot trickier for a lot of folks to understand cognitive disability, for example. And what does it mean that you have difficulty parsing information or learning information? And how the heck would that impact how you use my website anyways? We'll get to that. Don't worry. But we have these 5 broad categories. Okay. Time for another question round, just in case. I want to know what questions you have about disability. The next thing we're going to talk about is how do those of us with disabilities engage with the web? We're going to talk about assistive technology. It's going to be fun. Give you a few sec if we have questions to catch up. I should have hold music or a song I can sing. I'm going to give you all a sec. Oh, I'll scroll up too to see if there were any questions I maybe missed while I was talking. Saw the info in the chat. Oh, yeah, one of my friends mentioned that in this pandemic, the CDC's website is the worst they've experienced in terms of quality of info sharing. Yeah, I won't disagree with you on that one. Yeah, especially from an accessibility perspective. Oh, excellent. Yes, Angela, thank you for that. A reminder that a lot of us have disabilities that fall in more than one category. Absolutely. For one, I mean, trying to place everybody neatly into 5 little categories doesn't work out great, but they're a general reminder. And 2, excellent point. There are a lot of us that are multiply disabled or have a disability that impacts them in more than one way. Excellent. Mwah. Thank you for that reminder, Angela. I love it. Awesome. Any other questions or thoughts about disability? Otherwise, I'm going to keep on rolling. Cool. Okay. And feel free to just add in questions in chat whenever you have them. Don't worry if I'm not asking you for them. Okay, so let's keep moving. How do those of us with disabilities use the web? Ta-da! The same question, but in red, I guess. Oops. Okay. So one of the ways that we use the web is with assistive technology. That makes it easier for us to engage with things. There's a huge variety of assistive technology out there that we'll talk about. And some of us don't use anything at all. The other thing that's important to remember is that our proficiencies with assistive technology can vary a lot. Just because somebody is disabled and using assistive tech to access your website doesn't mean they're an expert in using that assistive technology. This is a common pitfall, frankly, in a lot of accessibility work. We'll assume that, oh, well, if you know about all the different settings and features in your screen reader, if you're blind, then this website works just fine. But that assumes that that person knows all the bells and whistles of their screen reader. They might be brand new to it. They might have just low digital literacy skills. So it's important to keep in mind that just because somebody uses assistive technology doesn't mean that they're an expert in all the different tiny little settings of it. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Okay, so we have a lot of different categories, again, of assistive technology. And I'm going to go through a bunch of examples for these. And keep in mind, there are a lot more kinds of assistive tech than the ones I'm listing. These are just some examples of some of the most common ones, or maybe some uncommon assistive tech that I just think is really interesting and wanted to mention. So there's a broad category that is hardware-based assistive technology. You have some physical thing you use, maybe you plug it into your computer, whatever. These include things like just a physical magnifier. And I think I have a picture I can show you. Yeah. So this is just, this is a photograph of somebody. I think they're using maybe it's a phone or a tablet. Or no, this is a whole magnifier device. That's right. And there's just a physical magnifying glass in front of the screen for them, making it larger. It's this little portable magnifying device. So you might use some physical hardware like that. Very low tech, like a magnifier, but it works. Other kinds of hardware-based assistive technology are large print keyboards or tactile keyboards that allow you to feel or more easily see the keys you're selecting. Also things like eye tracking systems. These are devices that allow you to control a computer just by where you're looking. It's really neat. I wish I had, again, 3 days so I could show you videos of all these things, but that's okay. Another kind of hardware assistive tech that I just think is really neat are refreshable braille displays. So I have a photograph of that here that I'll also describe for you. So this is a photograph of somebody using, it's maybe about a foot long. It's like a little keyboard looking kind of device. And they are able to have the output of their screen output as braille. So if you can see this image, you'll notice that there's little 2x4 little grids of what looks like little white dots. Those are tiny little plastic pegs arranged in the 2x4 pattern that braille is in. And that person can have the text of the screen output into braille. And as the screen updates or as they scroll or whatever, those little pins move up and down to change what braille characters under their fingers. They're very cool. They're especially used by folks who are deaf and blind. There are also some blind folks who just prefer a braille display over a screen reader. I think they're really neat. If you're not, somebody who's been exposed to these before, it can be such a very different way to conceive of interacting with a computer than reading it. I think they're really cool. That was our magnifier we saw. So in general, these are just a taste of different hardware assistive tech. So your website needs to work with whatever hardware we're using. And we'll talk about how you do that and how to make sure it works later. But people use different hardware. Your site needs to work with them. There's also software-based assistive technology. So things like a magnifier built into your computer. It's instead of a physical magnifier you're holding over it, it's like digitally, it's this little screen you can move around. Also speech recognition technology, that's software-based. Being able to speak to your computer or phone or whatever, have it recognize your voice and process it is great. Also, perhaps one of the biggest ones we talk about assistive technology-wise is screen readers. And let me explain a bit about what the heck a screen reader is. So at first, you might hear the name and assume that it just reads the content of the screen to you. If my slides were a website, maybe it would say software, assistive technology, screen readers, magnifier, blah, blah, blah. You get it, right? However, screen readers are much more powerful than that. So think about if you're a sighted person, right, who's in this webinar, and you're, I don't know, you're on the New York Times website, let's say, right? And you're wanting to just scroll through the website, look for some good news articles to read. When you're doing that, you're not reading every single word on the web page. Your eyes are catching different colors and shapes and sizes of text. So as you're scrolling through, you might only be reading maybe the titles of the news articles and not the little previews that you're given of them. And as you're scrolling and browsing, you see a title of an article that's appealing to you, then maybe you dive in and read more and click through, what have you. That's something that's very common in how we use the web. A screen reader allows somebody who can't see the screen or can't see it well or has other reasons for wanting to use a screen reader to do that same thing. So a screen reader can help you very easily, for example, only read the headings on a page. In that New York Times example, right? I might use a screen reader and have it read just the titles of the articles to me. And then when I get to an article title that, that's interesting, tell me more. I'll have it, tell me what the image has in it and read the text of the preview of the article to me, right? Screen readers can also be used to help to read, for example, just all the text of links on the page. So maybe I know where I'm going. Maybe it's my bank website, let's say, right? And I know, okay, I just need to jump to that login form, type in my username and password, hit enter. I might have it just read to me where the form elements are on the page. It's really cool. And when you think about it, it's parallel to how a sighted user skims a page. It's a similar kind of idea. So in short, a screen reader takes the code of a website, and instead of presenting it visually how a browser does, it presents that in an audio format. Screen readers, they're really neat. The other important thing to know, especially if you go looking for, there's all sorts of great videos on YouTube, and there's actually one been trending on Twitter recently of how blind folks will like use a phone or use a screen reader on a computer. You'll notice that folks who use screen readers every day usually have them output sound so quickly that if you're not used to it, you couldn't understand it at all. So oftentimes a proficient screen reader user can navigate a website way faster than somebody who's sighted. It's really neat. We have a lot of different kinds of software-based assistive tech. So your website needs to work with our software, needs to work with a screen reader, needs to work correctly with a magnifier. We'll talk about how we do that later. The other thing that we don't talk about as often, because it's not as cool and weird to think about if you're not used to it as like hardware and software assistive tech, is just using, a regular browser, a regular operating system, but changing the settings or enabling certain options and settings that aren't on by default. So examples of this, excuse me, are maybe changing the font of your website. There are a lot of settings in browser plugins that can be used to change the font to be more readable. An example of why someone might do that and what font they might use. So if you're familiar with dyslexia, there's I won't do a deep dive on dyslexia, but one of the things that can improve reading if you are dyslexic is changing a font. This font that I have an image of on screen is called Dyslexy. You'll notice that all these letters have like a visual weight to them, almost like the bottoms of the letters are heavier, they're thicker. Also, all of the letters are unique characters. So it's very common in a lot of fonts for a B and a D and a P to be exactly the same, but just rotated. And for a lot of folks with dyslexia, that can make it more difficult to read. So dyslexy, all of the B and the D and the P are all unique. They're slightly different shapes. So somebody who's dyslexic might choose to swap out the font on your website for this font that's way easier for them to read. You might also do things like text highlighting, have links, for example, highlighted in a different color in the browser. You might choose to navigate only with a keyboard, not using a mouse, but just, tabbing and space and enter and arrows and using just a keyboard to navigate a site. That's a assistive tech that I use. You might also choose to change the spacing of text, maybe make the line height bigger. You might make the fonts just bigger overall. You might also enable high contrast mode, especially in Windows. This takes all of the colors on your website and will make them higher contrast. And set to specific colors that user has set them to be. Somebody might also change a setting to disable motion, so turning off all animations and movement on a page. It's a lot of different settings, and there's a lot more than what I just listed, but some of these are the most common ones that we test for. And when we think about folks with disabilities using the web only in terms of like screen reader users, or people who use a specific device they plug in, we're ignoring all of the folks who just use things mostly as they are right now, but change settings. And quite frankly, in my opinion, some of the ones that may be hardest to what's the word I'm looking for? Not prepare for, whatever. Hardest to accommodate, that's the word I'm looking for. Imagine if you have a user that's changed all the fonts on your website, made it all larger and made it all high contrast. Your site is going to look super different, but you still need it to be usable by that person, and it needs to respect their settings. I gave you the dyslexia example. So right, if I'm changing settings, your site needs to respect what I have changed and properly change it. That's a lot to think about. We'll talk about it. Give me a sec. Water. Okay, One of the last things, somebody has a good question. Are assistive on-site plugins good for allowing visitors to change the settings? Ooh, that's a really good one. Assistive on-site plugins. So generally, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're asking about are a thing that can be present on a lot of websites where it'll be like a little sidebar on the side that you might click on, and somebody can select, I want to increase the font size or increase the contrast or whatever. I'm presuming that's what you're asking about. My answer is sort of two parts. If that's implemented correctly, it's a great way to do it. If your website is otherwise very accessible, respects, exactly, smiley face. Yeah, exactly. If your site is otherwise it's accessible, it's great, it respects the settings people change, it follows all the rules. We'll talk about what the rules are in a little bit, don't worry. And on top of that, you have a plugin. That's great. I do that on my own personal site. I think it can be great, right? However, the second half of my answer is that in my professional experience, a lot of the websites that use a plugin like that is the only thing they're doing to make their website accessible, and their entire site is very much not accessible. It's like, frankly, it's like they tried to slap a Christmas bow on top of a turd, right? It's like, okay, you kind of tried, but this doesn't work. This is awful. So to me, honestly, when I see a plugin like that on a site, it can be a red flag that the site is maybe not accessible. But ideally, I mean, if you do it right, they're great. Okay, let's keep trucking. Thank you for that great question, Zach. What were we talking about? Oh, right. We were talking about other ways that people might use the web. Oh, are there plugins I recommend? Remind me to talk about that later when we're more in general Q&A zone, because I'm going to keep on moving for right now, but good question. Right. We were talking about assistive technology. The other ways that people with disabilities use your site are by using the content you provide. That might not be apparent to folks who don't need it. These are things like captions on a video. These are things like content warnings before particularly emotionally upsetting content. These are things like alternative text on images, transcripts you provide for a video, sign language interpretation you provide for a video. So it's content that you're providing that people are using. So your site needs to have that content that we rely on. We'll pause for a question, and so I can drink some delicious water. I want to know what questions you have for me about assistive technology. Oof. You'll never know how self-conscious you could be about drinking a glass of water until you do it on a webinar on a webcam in front of 60-something people. What questions do you all have about assistive technology? Zach already asked a really good one. Does anyone else have a good one or a bad one? I don't care. I'll give you another minute. Just secretly giving me more time for water. Okay. Ooh, Angela, that is such... Oh, mwah. Angela, you're my new best friend. Angela's question is, how are you supposed to anticipate all the options that are out there? I'm kind of reading your tone into it, but the 3 question marks feels exasperated. Excellent. Applaud. I applaud you, Angela. Very good question. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit, because instead of thinking about, oh gosh, there's like 100 different things somebody could use to look at my website. What do I do? We have sets of guidelines that we'll talk about in a little bit that guide you through that. And if you comply with that set of guidelines, then it will work with most all kinds of assistive technology. The other recommendation I have for you, and we'll talk about this a bit more later. Actually, this might be part 2. We'll think about it. Anyways, are having just testing with some of the most common assistive technologies. There's a, I think it's yearly or bi-yearly survey of screen reader users. And one of the questions in it is, what screen reader technology do you use? What browser do you use? And what operating system? And I personally, when I'm doing screen reader testing, I don't test every single screen reader out there and every browser. I just use the most common combinations. Other good questions. How do you recommend prioritizing the areas of your website to make compatible with assistive tech for getting started? Another good question. Y'all are on fire with your questions. This will be a teaser for part 2, which is next week. But in general, if you have an existing website and you are trying to prioritize making it compatible with assistive tech, excuse me, I would recommend first picking the ones that are the most common, like high priority parts of your website. So like your homepage, your contact us page, and maybe if it's your like a purchase path or a donation path, the most commonly used important pages. Do I have a suggestion for a list of assistive tech that we should look for while we build a website? I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, how I'm interpreting your question is there a specific like list of assistive technology you should be kind of testing against when you build a website? And if that's your question, that will be answered shortly. That set of guidelines we're going to talk about in a bit is kind of that list. So get ready, get excited. Okay. Oh, awesome. You say, yes, great. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Good question. Okay. I'm presuming folks had enough time, so let's keep moving. We have talked about what the heck accessibility is. What is disability? How do people with disabilities use the web? And now, more of the actual meat of my talk, in my opinion, is why would you make a website accessible? Why would we do this? And then, how do we know if a website is accessible? Which will answer a lot of the questions y'all asked. So why do we make an accessible website? Now, I'm presuming that I'm slightly preaching to the choir with this. You are the folks, of course, who chose to take some of your time to come to a web accessibility webinar. So presumably, you already have some reasons in mind for why you care about accessibility or why you build accessible websites, and that's awesome. So I'm not focusing on trying to convince you all, because presumably you're already convinced. This is more going to be a list that I use when I am talking with different clients of mine or maybe more skeptical folks. And you can think of this list of reasons to build an accessible website as different tools in your tool belt, sort of different levers to pull. Also, there are a lot of different reasons, and some of them are just more altruistic than others. Some of these are very strong emotional arguments, and some are very strong like financial arguments. And folks folks will commonly ask me when I give a talk like this, oh, well, but shouldn't I just do it because it's the right thing to do? Shouldn't I just build a website that's accessible because I'm a good person? And I mean, yeah. Yeah, but in a lot of contexts, that's not enough to convince some people to, invest the time and the effort and the resources in doing it. So we're going to go through a lot of different reasons. The first one, as I alluded to, is that it's the right thing to do. I believe that we have an ethical duty to make everything we make usable by everybody, including people with disabilities. Period. It's the right thing to do. Another great reason is that disability amplifies usability problems. So let's say, for example, I don't know, let's go back to my login form example on a bank website, right? Maybe that login form doesn't have like error text. If I've done something wrong, it doesn't tell me what I did wrong. If I don't have a disability, that's going to be confusing and frustrating, probably, right? What the heck? I typed my password. Why isn't it working? However, If I have a disability that impacts how I engage with that form, that usability problem is going to be massively amplified. So maybe I am a screen reader user, right? And there's no error message. Is that because the site is coded incorrectly? Is something wrong with my screen reader? What's going on? I'm super confused. Or if, for example, you're autistic like I am, and you try to use that form and no error message displays, it's a lot more like cognitively and emotionally overwhelming and confusing and hard to deal with. Usability issues can be way worse for those of us with disabilities. On the flip side, a tiny usability improvement that makes things Can somebody say something in the chat? It just said I got disconnected and I can't tell if I'm still here or not. Jessa says, you're back. That was very weird. It like turned off my audio. Oh, someone else says they lost sound. We'll give it a sec. We'll give the internet a sec. Okay. Oh, and now everyone says they can hear me. You're back. Hooray. I feel so loved. Thank you all for helping me out. That was very strange. We'll keep on going. I was talking about, usability improvements. So a good example of this, of a small usability improvement that could be a big improvement. Let's give actually a great example that I've experienced in my life as somebody with a disability. Maybe a museum website, let's say. There's not clear information on if this museum is a free museum or if I have to pay. There's no information about pricing anywhere. It's confusing. If you're somebody without a disability, you might just still be a little confused by that and, figure it out and research it or, whatever. However, if I have a cognitive disability like I do, I might be super confused and overwhelmed and wonder, did I miss something? Did I misread something? What did I do? How do I find out how much the museum costs? Oh, this is stressful. Just an example. But making that tiny improvement of maybe making a quick and easy guide to visiting the museum on your website or having a clear pricing page is a small usability improvement. Maybe in that case, it's actually pretty big, but you know what I mean. For folks without a disability, that's a usability improvement, but it makes a huge impact on those of us with disabilities. So accessibility correlates with usability, I would say. I would say that so much that I put it on a slide. Look at me. Also, accessibility improvements benefit in a lot of other ways. So if you are making, for example, the language more clear and easy to understand on your website, that helps folks who are still learning the language that your website is in. Makes it easier to understand and parse. If you have made your interaction patterns really clear, right? Like you're using clear, understandable icons and the information is laid out in an intuitive way. That also really helps folks who have low digital literacy skills. That is, folks who are not very proficient using the internet or a phone or a computer, whatever. Helps folks who don't have a disability but just aren't very familiar with technology. And the things we do to make a website accessible also are a huge help to people who maybe are using older devices, older browsers, or just have like a weak or slow internet connection. The same things that, for example, if I am low vision and I rely on alternative text and captions for images to know what's going on in the image, if you provide those on the website, that helps somebody with those disabilities. But that also helps folks, for example, who have a really, really poor mobile internet connection, such to the point that they can't really load images. And instead, the alternative text is being loaded for the images. So the things you do to help accessibility also improve usability massively. So that's another great reason, in my opinion. Accessibility helps everyone, not only from that usability perspective we talked about, but just in general. Think back maybe a half hour ago when we were talking about situational disability, right? The context where the context essentially causes you to interact with something as though you have a disability. This is called, the idea of accessibility helping everyone is called the curb cut effect. And let's sort of talk about this example. So especially those of you who've thought about accessibility in physical spaces are probably super familiar with this. I have a photo here of a curb cut, not glamorous, but very practical. It's when you're walking off the sidewalk into a street and the curb kind of dips down with a little ramp. Those, as you might not be aware, are actually a relatively new thing, have only existed in the last few decades since the Americans with Disabilities Act. And a curb cut exists by law to help wheelchair users and other mobility device users, just people with disabilities, to navigate down the curb into the street and cross the street successfully. It's great. It's necessary. A curb cut also is a huge help to everyone else. Maybe you're skateboarding down the sidewalk and you want to cross the street, but you're not very good at skateboarding, so you can't jump off the curb and you need a ramp. Or more practically, maybe you're pushing a stroller with a child in it. Maybe you are carrying something really big and it's kind of blocking your view of your feet, and you're trying to walk up the curb without tripping. Maybe you're looking at your phone and just not paying attention and you don't want to trip. Having that curb cut, it exists, the curb cut exists for people with disabilities, but it's a huge help to everyone else. And excellent comment in the chat. When it works for us, it works for everyone. Amen. That curb cut effect also applies digitally. A great example of this, I have an image, a screenshot rather, of just a YouTube video. I think this is about the history of Red Rocks, with some captions on display. Those captions on a YouTube video are necessary for somebody, let's say, who's deaf or hard of hearing. They need a caption to know what's going on. They're also something that those of us with cognitive disabilities or auditory processing issues might rely on. And they exist. One of the major reasons they exist are for people with disabilities, but they're also a huge help to everyone else. So maybe I forgot my headphones and I'm in the office, right? And I don't want to bother everyone else around me with the audio I'm playing. So I want to get the message from the video. I might just watch it with captions. Or let's say the person in the video has a strong accent, right? And they're speaking a language I understand. Maybe they're Cockney, right? They have a strong Cockney accent and it's English, but I don't really understand it. I might rely on captions. There's a lot of cases in which somebody might use captions while not having a disability at all. Those captions being present helps everyone. That's the curb cut effect digitally. Okay, other reasons we might build an accessible website. Accessibility might be in line with your mission statement for your organization. And that seems maybe like a trivial reason, right? Your mission statement, or maybe a code of conduct you have, or a diversity statement, what have you. My point is that your organization has some commitment to social justice. Maybe it has a commitment to inclusiveness and diversity. Like I said, it might sound trivial, but this is a thing I will often point out to clients. Like, oh, well, on your website right now, you have in your mission statement for your members that you don't discriminate on the basis of race and gender and blah, 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 and disability. Web accessibility is a part of not discriminating on the basis of disability. So that can be a really helpful tool, is to invoke organizational statements. Accessibility also means a wider market share. as you recall, that stat from earlier, 10% of Americans have a disability that significantly impacts how we use technology. Why would you want to exclude 10% of your customer base or your funding base? That's silly. You want that wider market share. Accessibility also improves public perception. Both, I mean, from a usability perspective, right? If your website is accessible and usable, people are going to like you more. But also if you are demonstrating an organizational commitment to caring about people with disabilities, that improves the public perception of your organization. And also even specifically with those of us with disabilities, if I had the option of going to, I don't know, 2 different stores, let's say, right? And both of them sell the thing I need and both of them have it at the same price. But one of the stores is way more accessible for me. I'm going to pick the more accessible one. Those of us with disabilities, we very much will prefer the ones we can actually use, both because we can use it, but also because that organization has demonstrated that they care about us. Accessibility also increases compatibility of your website with a wide variety of devices and browsers. As we talked about with assistive technology, and we'll talk about in a bit about how we do this, but so we talked about with assistive technology, you have to be thinking about a wide variety of devices. So if you're making your website accessible, you're also kind of for free making a website that is responsive at the same time. It works with mobile devices. It'll work with different devices, with different browsers. So if you're prioritizing accessibility, you're also doing all that stuff too, which increases your reach massively. Another really big one that folks don't talk about as much, but I think is a really good reason. Accessibility improves your SEO of your website. What? How? What? That's amazing. That's so cool. If you're not familiar with SEO as a concept, it's search engine optimization. It's essentially when somebody is searching on Google or another search engine for you or the thing you do, they'll find you. The things that we do to make a website accessible, especially having headings laid out clearly and having important information in the headings, having the title of your page, that is it's what shows up in the tab. Hopefully I'm pointing to your browser tab right now. This one says big marker webinar room, the title of your page. Those things are super important for accessibility and are also super important for SEO. So if you're doing all this work to make your website accessible, you're also just kind of automatically improving the SEO of your website, which is really cool, I think. I mean, I even recall, I think there were some folks earlier who said they specifically do SEO work. So good reason for you to care about accessibility. It helps people care about the thing you do. Pretty cool. Other reasons to care about accessibility, it increases your eligibility for government funds. We'll talk about the legal aspects of this in a bit, but essentially, especially, I'm sure a lot of you folks are probably aware, there are a lot of government funds available if and only if the services you provide are accessible to people with disabilities. So if your site's accessible, you have access to those funds potentially. And one of the most common reasons you'll hear folks talk about, accessibility is a human right that is protected by law in the United States. Simply put, your website legally has to be accessible. Ta-da! What a great reason. We're going to talk and do a dive about the law aspects of accessibility. But first, we will pause for a commercial break and a question break. Not a commercial break, I'm joking. What questions do you have about why you would build an accessible site? I didn't talk very much about like how to convince somebody that accessibility is important, but if you have questions about that, I'm all ears. So I'll give you a sec to answer some questions or to ask questions. This is my song for waiting for questions. Do questions. Maybe folks don't have questions. That's okay. I'm also not sure if there's a delay on the chat. I didn't bother to figure that out. Whatever. Okay, I'm going to assume that folks do not have questions about why we would build an accessible website. And that's totally fine. And if you think of some later, you can ask them later. Okay, laws, accessibility and laws. Woohoo! Angela asked a really good question. How far in accessibility is far enough? Ooh, I really like that question. So part of my answer to that is, we'll find out in a second. We're going to talk about legally what's far enough. I guess I think my answer is honestly, it depends. I know that's not helpful, but like, it depends on what your goal is, I guess is what I'm saying, right? Is your goal, we just want to be legally compliant? Well, then that's how far enough is for you. It might be every current user of our website can use it regardless of their disability. Then you need to do all the things that takes it to that point. If it's, we don't want any person to have any problem ever with the accessibility of our website, then you need to go pretty far. It's kind of up to how you personally define that for your organization. And that's something that I will often work with my clients to define. Luckily, though, for the most part, there's a pretty standard answer that is far enough for most people, process-wise and accessibility-wise, which give me about 15, 20 minutes, and I'll answer that question in my slides. Thank you for the question. I super appreciate it. Okay. Someone asked another question. Working with a lot of creatives that are constantly pushing for the next big new thing in web design. Amen. How do you convince them that an accessible website doesn't need to be, in their word, lame? How it doesn't, boom, perfect. That's a really, really good question. So in my work of creating our accessibility process and work at Clique years ago, that was a hurdle I faced, and it's a hurdle that I deal with when helping external designers as well. How to see accessibility not as like, it's gonna be boring and black and white and big text and it's gonna look awful. So first off, I like to reframe it for designers as accessibility is like a fun limitation, right? And something that sort of breeds creativity as opposed to like, it's boring. Some of the coolest things that designers I know make are when somebody has a restriction on them, right? You end up thinking innovatively because of that restriction. It's kind of a fun problem to solve. And for some designers, that reframing is all they need. Other ways that might work for you in pushing creatives into caring about accessibility is framing it in terms of, how to put it? This website isn't any good if people can't use it, right? Like it could be really cool and flashy and pretty, but like if I can't use it or do anything with it, then you failed. Like that's kind of strong, but like if people can't use the thing you designed, you failed to design that thing. You've done a bad job. Another maybe more positive way to convince creatives of accessible design is to show them examples of accessible sites that also look just really cool, right? And somebody actually also asked, do you have examples of websites that have done accessibility well? Yeah, good question. I can actually I think we have ways that I can follow up and send you all links because off the top of my head, it's it's hard. But there are a lot of excellent websites out there. Our portfolio, actually, if you look at cliquestudios.com, I will add the caveat that I know there are one or two little accessibility issues on our current site that I have a dev fixing this week. So it's not perfect. It's not perfect right now, caveat. But actually, cliquestudios.com is a really good example of a very trend-forward website, to put it, that is also very accessible and also like embraces accessibility. If you take a look at our website, we have a lot of persistent animations and movement, which is very on trend. However, that's not accessible. So we have a pause button that globally pauses like the whole motion on the website. But the pause button, instead of being like, oh, someone, Fen says I had to have a pause button, so it's there. Our designers integrated that pause button into the look and feel and brand of the site. And the pause button itself looks really cool. So take a look at us. We also have things like in our portfolio that we've made that are very accessible and I think look really cool. But I don't want to just toot my own horn. There are a lot of other people that have done a great job. Off the top of my head, 18F, that's the number 18 and then the letter F.gov. They're essentially the digital agency for the federal government. I have friends that work there. And they do a really great job of having a cool looking, very, very, very accessible website. So yeah, I can share more resources. And if folks who, I know some of you in this webinar have a lot of accessibility experience. If you have some examples off the top of your head that look, cool and hip and trendy and are also accessible, feel free to throw them in the chat. I want to help Christina out with that. My last answer to your question is there are a lot of people who started talking about accessibility as though it is the big hot new trend in web design, which on the one hand I think is a little problematic because it shouldn't be a trend. It should be a thing we always do. But caring about accessibility is frankly kind of the hot new thing for a lot of folks and a lot of companies. It's like, oh, wow, what if we made it accessible? Whoa, cool, trendy. So you can also frame accessibility as a trendy thing. There's a lot of articles that have done that. Someone asked suggestions for those who are building a web template or something like Squarespace. I will talk about that more in the Q&A session since it's a little more off topic, but good question. And somebody asked that same question, accessibility done well. Boom. Thank you for your questions, everybody. I feel very appreciated because of your good questions. Okay, I'm gonna keep moving. Right, we're talking about laws. My caveat for you is that laws are different around the world, obviously, but about accessibility. For the sake of time, I've also made the assumption that probably most of you are working in the US. That might not be a correct assumption, but what I'm going to talk about are just United States laws. Benefit, though, the concept of compliance and how you legally make an accessible website is very similar around the world. And also the United States has, relatively speaking, do I want to say this? I was going to say some of the more clear guidelines about compliance, but that's in the weeds. Don't worry about it. My point is I'm talking about United States compliance. Sorry. Okay. There's two main laws we think about as far as legal accessibility in the US. The first is the Rehabilitation Act, passed in 1973. Generally, you'll hear people talk about Section 508 of the Rehab Act. The Rehab Act prevents discrimination on the basis of disability in programs that are conducted by federal agencies, programs receiving federal funds, and federal employment, and federal contractors. In short, if you're receiving any kind of federal money, working with the federal government, the word federal comes up at all when you talk about your finances, the Rehab Act probably applies to you. Section 508 specifically, though, is the part that is relevant to websites. It requires that information technology broadly and websites more specifically meet the guidelines of that act. Now, in the past, Section 508 had a whole separate set of guidelines you had to follow from the next law we're about to talk about. But within the last few years, they've actually been synthesized to be the same set of guidelines we refer to for both. So in the past, you maybe had to do a whole separate round of QA to meet Section 508. But now, for the most part, unless you have very strict requirements organizationally, it's kind of all the same thing. So good news for you on that. The one that you'll hear about a bit more commonly in the for-profit world is the Americans with Disabilities Act. This was passed in 1990. It's also referred to as the ADA. You might hear that a lot. It is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. It has similar protections against discrimination as the Civil Rights Act from 1964, which made discrimination on the basis of race, religion, sex, national origin illegal. I will note, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit, but notice all the things that the Civil Rights Act made illegal. And I guess, as we all know, if something's illegal, no one does it. But you know my point. A law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of disability wasn't passed for almost 30 years after the Civil Rights Act. I just think that's worth noting. Okay, how is compliance with those laws enforced, right? Is there some federal agency or accessibility police or somebody that's going to come around and yell at you? No. So we mentioned before availability for federal funds. In a lot of cases, you're only eligible for federal funds if you comply with the Rehabilitation Act. So if you don't comply, if your website isn't accessible, well, goodbye federal funds for your website. But the main way that these are enforced, especially the ADA, is lawsuits. Hooray! Yay! You can tell how unenthusiastic I am. Lawsuits aren't a fun thing to talk about. But in my experience, for a good chunk of organizations, the threat of lawsuits is the only way to actually have an accessible website, unfortunately. So these lawsuits, to give you a taste, just so you don't think this is certain kinds of organizations, these are just a few organizations or individuals that have had a web accessibility lawsuit against them in recent years. Netflix, Nike, Domino's Pizza, we'll talk more about them in a sec, H&R Block, the National Museum of Crime and Punishment, Duke, Harvard, MIT, Beyonce. I'm not joking. I know that kind of, when you look at this list and then Beyonce's on there, it feels like a joke. It's not a joke. In general, how these accessibility lawsuits happen are some of the times somebody will, let's say there's a problem with your website. It's inaccessible for an individual. Some of the times a person will just contact you like, hey, I'm blind and I use a screen reader and I'm trying to do XYZ on your website and I can't. Can you fix that? Which is honestly a thing that we should all be grateful to hear, to get feedback that somebody's having an issue with our website. And maybe you fix it and then there you go, it's all done. But some organizations receive a message like that and ignore it or don't care, and that escalates into a lawsuit. In other cases, there are folks who specifically, and organizations that specifically spend time and resources in helping to enforce the consequences of breaking the law by looking for websites that have accessibility problems and serving them with a notice that they are being sued or with the threat of a lawsuit, which isn't fun. It's not fun. I have never had a client I have worked with be sued because of an inaccessible website, but I have worked with clients who have received a lawsuit and then contact us at Clique to help them fix their website that someone else made. So I have been involved in remediating websites that have been sued, and it's not fun. I mean, nobody wants to be sued, but it's also just it's a big downer to work on a project like that. The example I specifically wanted to call out for you, there's two of them on here. Domino's Pizza. You may or may not have heard of this lawsuit. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court at the end of last year. Domino's essentially, long story short, a part of their website was inaccessible to people who are blind that use a screen reader. And when I say inaccessible, I don't mean like, oh, I couldn't use this one little part of it and it kind of doesn't work right. I mean, like, you couldn't use the website if you were blind. Just like it did not work at all. Domino's has to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act because I guess I'm realizing, backing up, I didn't fully explain what the ADA covers. Essentially, anything that is considered a public good or service. Really anything that involves the exchange of money, anything that people can just access or choose to use, restaurants, museums, lawyers' offices, like most everything that isn't like a private club. Okay. So anyway, going back, Domino's, Supreme Court lawsuit. Domino's was notified that their website isn't usable by screen reader users, and Domino's said, we don't care. Or rather, Domino's said, we don't legally think we have an obligation to make it accessible to you. I'm gonna I'm going to hope that there's no one here who works for Domino's in the chat. If so, I apologize, but we're diving in. And this was argued and appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, where Domino's argued to the Supreme Court that they shouldn't have to make their website usable to people with disabilities. There were a lot of people boycotting Domino's as a result. Ultimately, luckily for those of us who do accessibility work, the Supreme Court ruled that no, your website does have to be accessible. You do have to follow the law. Domino's was trying to argue that because the Americans with Disabilities Act doesn't explicitly mention websites, that it doesn't apply to them. But whatever. You can tell I have a lot of opinions about this. That's the Domino's Pizza lawsuit. Beyonce was sued earlier last year, or was it late 2018? I forget. Either way, doesn't matter. Beyonce's previous website was, in my opinion, unusable by like anyone. It was really pretty, going back to that excellent question that Christina asked about trendy things. It was really pretty. It had a lot of pretty images. It had pretty effects, but like you couldn't figure out how to navigate it or use it. And because one of the things on her website was e-commerce, like buying her merchandise, it legally had to be accessible. So Beyonce's website is much more accessible and nicer now. And I haven't looked at it in a bit, but that might be an example of an accessible website that also looks really cool. So yeah, the reason I bring up Beyonce is a lot of the public response to that was a sort of, oh no, poor Beyonce, she's being sued. And listen, I love Beyonce, but she's doing fine. And in this context, it's important to frame lawsuits as it is somebody's civil rights being violated. It's not a poor business that is being sued. Somebody's suing because they've been denied their rights. Okay. Tirade about lawsuits over. Other stats for you to know, because you might be wondering how often do these happen and how has our global pandemic impacted this? So on average in 2019, there were 7 website accessibility lawsuits filed per day. And there was a almost 200% increase in lawsuits from 2018 to 2019. And it continues to trend up. In March and April of this year, we saw a little bit of dip in accessibility lawsuits filed, unsurprisingly. But immediately back in May, they were back up on 2019's trend to again be like record-breaking amounts of accessibility lawsuits. So they are there. They are very much still happening in 2020. Okay, let's take a breath, a cleansing breath, and set aside this stressful idea of lawsuits. We're gonna leave it over there and move forward. I want to talk about why we have these laws. Why do we have the ADA? Why do we have the Rehab Act? This is because of the disability rights movement. And I'm going to read a little thing to you because this author put this far better than I ever could. So this is an image I'm about to describe to you. This is from an article called Capital Crawl, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And I want to give you an idea of history here. On Monday, March 12, 1990, disability rights activists descended on the U.S. Capitol demanding passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which would give equal rights to people with disabilities. The ADA was passed by the Senate the year before, but was finding complications getting through the House of Representatives. Over 1,000 protesters came to protest the act's delay. After the day's rally and speeches, over 60 activists abandoned their wheelchairs and mobility devices and began crawling up the 83 stone steps to the U.S. Capitol building, during which people were loudly chanting, "What do we want? ADA. When do we want it? Now." Other activists remained at the bottom, holding signs and giving encouragement. "I want my civil rights," or quote, "I want my civil rights." Paulette Patterson of Chicago stated as she was inching her way to the top. "I want to be treated like a human being." This photograph is of 8-year-old Jennifer Keelan, who was famously taped while crawling up the stairs. "I'll take all night if I have to," she firmly stated. The second grader from Denver suffered from cerebral palsy. I would disagree with this language now. Ugh, I wouldn't say suffered. The second grader, this is an old article from the 90s. The second grader from Denver has cerebral palsy and decided to partake in the crawl after joining ADAPT, which is Americans Disabled for Accessible Public Transit. It's an organization. She was inspired by her friend, Kenny Perkins, who passed away in January of 1990. As she reached the top, she said, "I'm doing it for Kenny." That is Jennifer from Denver. She's really cool, still does accessibility activism work now. Let me go to the next slide, give you more of an idea. This is a text from an article by Arlene Mayerson. The ADA owes its birthright not to any one person or any few, but to the many thousands of people who make up the disability rights movement. People who have worked for years organizing and attending protests, drafting legislation, speaking, testifying, negotiating, lobbying, filing lawsuits, being arrested, doing whatever they could for a cause they believed in. Without the work of so many, without the disability rights movement, there wouldn't be an ADA. Pause for effect. I mention all of this because it's really easy when we're thinking about why we make things accessible and make websites accessible to think of this in terms of, I have to comply with the law because the law says I have to do this. Womp. I find it very helpful to remind people that accessibility is a civil rights issue. Okay. The other thing I want you to know about legal compliance is that compliance is just a passing grade. It means, congratulations, you won't be sued. It's not the ideal. So to go back to the question somebody had asked a bit ago, what's good enough? Compliance, depending on your definition, might not be good enough. That's just a passing grade. The other thing I want you to know is that meeting current legal guidelines isn't future-proof and isn't the best way to make sure your site stays accessible going forward and stays compliant going forward. So how do we keep it accessible going forward? We'll talk about that now and also in part 2 next week. But I want to know what questions you have about legal compliance. And then we will move on to our last stage, which is, how do we know if a website is accessible? I'll give y'all a few minutes. What questions do you have about legal compliance? This is my waiting for questions song. I'm waiting for questions, letting you type, taking a minute to see what you say. Time for questions. You can tell I'm not paid to sing. Okay, I'm going to assume that there are no questions. And if there are, still ask them, but I'm going to keep moving. Okay, the thing you are probably here for. How do we know if a website is accessible? Air punches, because I'm excited. Okay, if you only pay attention to one slide this entire time, if you've been sleeping or doing other work as I talk, which it's fine, no judgment, this is the slide to pay attention to. Test your designs and your website with people with disabilities. Ask people with disabilities if they can use your site. Period. That's what you need to do, ideally. However, you don't want your developer pestering a bunch of other people every time they write every line of code. You don't want a designer to, be having to test over and over and over and over again and have it go poorly. We also have other things we can do to make sure our site is accessible. But at the end of the day, you don't know what's accessible until you've tested with actual people with disabilities. I'd also recommend involving people with disabilities in the creation of your website. It's pretty dang easy to make sure that it's visually accessible if you have a colorblind designer, if you have developers who are also blind who use screen readers. Make sure that there are people with disabilities on your team. It's one of the best ways to build something that is inclusive. So if the people impacted by it are the people making it. But more than anything else, you can make sure that your website is accessible if you comply with this set of guidelines, which I know a few folks mentioned early on. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or the WCAG, or WCAG. It's an awful acronym to pronounce, but the WCAG. Oh, somebody asked a good question I'll get to in just a little bit. The WCAG is an international set of guidelines and rules that was developed by the World Wide Web Consortium. They are the group of people that essentially decide how the internet should work. How does HTML work? How do browsers work? What are the underlying rules we all have to follow? and they developed that underlying set of rules about accessibility, the WCAG. Oh, I have that in there twice. Sorry, here we go. So in the WCAG, there are 3 different conformance levels. We'll talk about what the guidelines are more specifically in a minute, but there's dozens and dozens of different guidelines and rules you have to follow. Those are sorted out into 3 different conformance levels that are A, AA, and AAA. A are the least strict and AAA are the most strict. And they're also inclusive. So if you're AA compliant or conformant, you're also single A conformant. Single A is considered to be like the absolute bare minimum for accessibility. And from a legal perspective in the United States and around the world, it's not good enough. So we don't honestly talk about it very much. AA is considered the minimum for legal compliance. It's considered good enough for accessibility. If your website follows the WCAG AA guidelines, which is often how you'll heard it discussed, if you're compliant with AA, your website will work for most people with disabilities in most situations with most technology, which is pretty good. That's pretty great. In general, it's relatively easy to meet if you're integrating accessibility processes into making the website. If you're trying to make a website compliant that already exists, it might take a bit more time, but hey, that's okay. The highest conformance level is AAA. They're the ones you ideally should meet. They're stricter guidelines. For example, there are guidelines about color contrast in the WCAG. There's a AA color contrast rule and a stricter AAA color contrast rule that essentially things have to have even higher contrast. Ideally, you should try to meet the AAA guidelines if you can. If it's possible, why not do it? It'll be more accessible. However, there are a lot of things in AAA that can be cost prohibitive for a lot of folks. For example, something that's in AAA guidelines is you need to have a sign language interpretation for every video on your site. Now, that might be something, ideally, it would be great if we had that for every site, right? However, if you're a small organization that puts out a high volume of videos with very little funding, you're going to have a hard time being able to add sign language to every single video you put out. And so you might not be able to meet WCAG AAA guidelines. It's just not realistic. So in general, my recommendation is to try to meet WCAG AA guidelines. This is what I tell most of my clients, unless you have a very strong need for parts of AAA. Also, if there are certain populations you serve, like we talked about ages ago, but certain populations you serve that have higher incidence of certain kinds of disability, I would recommend focusing on those as well, even if that's above and beyond the WCAG. So for example, if, I don't know, a good example is maybe you make a kind of technology that's a device that is used by a lot of blind people. You might specifically make your website even more accessible than the minimum, specifically when it comes to screen readers. Just an example. WCAG AA is what generally is considered to be good enough for legal compliance, though. Okay. So inside the WCAG, what the heck are these rules? What do they even say? You might be tempted to go just read the WCAG, which you might do. You might enjoy that. I like it. A lot of folks can find it maybe overwhelming because it's a big list of guidelines. So there are different tools you can use, specifically the WCAG Quick Reference, which is on the WCAG's website. That'll help you filter out, only the ones you want to comply with, only like AA, and only things that have to do with visual design, let's say. But you should know, regardless of what you do, the 4 principles that are inside the WCAG. The first is perceivable. These are guidelines that say that your site needs to be perceived by the senses. Operable. Different input methods must be functional for your website with a wide range of devices. So all the different ways I can click on things or type or whatever need to work with different ways I might use the site. Your site needs to be understandable. The content on the site and the user interface elements need to be comprehensible by people. And your site needs to be robust. It has to work with a wide range of software and devices. Give you some quick examples in here of each of these. In perceivable, we need to have text alternative for non-text content. Audio and video need to have captions or transcripts available. The content needs to be presentable in different ways without losing meaning. So I need to be able to see it. A trivial example is in portrait or in landscape orientation on my phone. You also need to make it easier for users to see and hear your content. For example, it needs to have high enough contrast. Fonts need to be large enough. You need to be able to perceive it. Operable guidelines include that all your functionality needs to be usable without a mouse, using only a keyboard. You need to give users enough time to read and use your content. You need to help users navigate and find content on the site. You need to make it easier to use non-keyboard inputs as well. We talked about those different ways somebody can interact with a computer, like the eye gaze systems, right? That's a different way to give input without using a keyboard. Understandable examples. Your text needs to be readable and understandable at an appropriate level. Content needs to appear and operate in predictable ways. Unpredictable, distracting things can't happen. You need to help users avoid and correct their mistakes with appropriate error messages and allowing them to edit their responses. And robust. The easiest way I have to put this is your developers need to write their code correctly. They have to write HTML following the rules of HTML. And in doing so, maximize compatibility with current and future user tools. So if I use a screen reader, it needs to work with my screen reader. If I use a magnifier, it needs to work with my magnifier. It needs to be robust. Okay, how do we know that our site complies with the WCAG? We have a lot of rules. We have a lot of things to keep in mind. The way that you do that is with professional testing. This can be someone like me who tests your website using automated tools and then different manual tests and manual things I look at. You also should have designers who are working on your site be familiar with the parts of the WCAG that are about visual design. They should know them and ideally be doing some self-QA as they go along. At Clique, a part of our design process involves like a crit, essentially, where a designer, that's an excellent question. I'll answer that in just a moment. Our designers present their design for the other designers on their team. They discuss it and make improvements. And part of that is they review the accessibility of one another's designs. Developers should also be using the tools at their disposal to even just automatically check their code for them to see if it's accessible. They should be doing self-QA and be trained in how to do that as they go along. There are also different tools you can use if you're not a designer or a developer. Maybe you write content or you just manage the website. There are tools you can use to know if your site meets the WCAG. And these are all things that I will be giving you resources for in part 2, which is next week. Let me check out these questions that I skipped as I talked. Do I have tools I recommend for testing? Yes, I do. And it sounds cheesy, but that's what we're going to talk about next week in part 2, which is how to make your site accessible and keep it accessible. So we'll talk about that. If you want a teaser, a spoiler for next week, though, I would recommend looking up accessibility insights for web. It's a tool created with Microsoft, an accessibility consulting firm. It's free. I love it. It's good, but you should come to part 2 next week. The other question was, what is your opinion of groups that test your site for you? Running it through a JAWS reader. JAWS is a specific brand of screen reader, at least to get a read on where your issues are. Hope I'm not jumping the gun. You're not jumping the gun. You're fine. My opinion of groups that test your site for you is it's great. I love it. I have a lot of friends that work for the big consulting accessibility organizations that you're likely thinking of that do that work. And I also do that work. So I think it's great. I'm biased. But if you don't have, I think using an external group to test your site for you is way, way, way better if you are able to do that than trying, if you're not trained, to test it yourself. There are actually, in some of those lawsuits I mentioned, there are some specific examples of web accessibility lawsuits where the defendant had said, well, but we had our developer, or we had our marketer or whatever, run a little test to see if it was accessible, and it said it was fine. And they tried to use that as a defense. Those people aren't quite trained in what they're doing, and they made a lot of mistakes, thus the accessibility lawsuit. So I would recommend using folks who are trained in that to do it for you, or get the resources and the training yourself. And I will provide a lot of awesome resources for that next week. But yeah, I think it's an awesome opportunity to use external sources if you don't have them internally. I think that's great. If you can't make it yourself, store-bought is fine, right? Okay, that's the WCAG. Let's keep moving. Oh, right, my next slide. So what questions do you have about the WCAG specifically? I should have said this before I started answering questions. I hope those answered your questions sufficiently. Give you a minute or two. But otherwise, we're going to have a broad Q&A time in just a minute. Actually, I'm going to move into that because we're almost there. We're almost there. Okay, so how do we weave accessibility into our process of making a website or fixing a website that already exists to be accessible? And oh, thank you for your question. The difference between the WCAG 2 and 2.1. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes. So for those who aren't aware, the WCAG, unsurprisingly, has gone through different versions. WCAG 2.0 came out in 2008, I believe. 2008 sounds about right. And 2.1 was finalized and released beginning of last year. 2.1 added in some new guidelines, which actually there's some really helpful references for on the WCAG site itself. It can show you these are the new things that were added in. As you might not be surprised to hear, given that it hasn't been updated from 2008 till now, a lot of guidelines were added in about mobile accessibility, because 2008, we didn't really think about the mobile web. So it talks about using like touchscreen accessibility, small screen size accessibility. There's also a lot more guidelines added in that have to do with cognitive accessibility, because it wasn't thought about much before then. The WCAG 2.1 is the current version. So that is what you frankly need to be referencing when you're referencing the WCAG and legal compliance. All of the website accessibility lawsuits, I shouldn't say all, most of the accessibility lawsuits in the last 12 months or so all refer to the WCAG 2.1 and not WCAG 2.0. So frankly, consider 2.0 trash, throw it in the garbage. It's old, it's crappy, we don't care about it. We want to reference the 2.1. Good question. Okay, back to my point here. How do we weave accessibility into the process of making a website, and how do we keep it accessible long-term? Because we know about disability, we know about accessibility, we care about it, we know why we care about it, and we know how to know if a site is accessible. But how do we do it? We know all this theory, Fen, but how do we do it? Find out next week in part 2, keeping your website accessible. As a reminder, the description of this event that I wrote generally says that you'll develop your accessibility knowledge by learning the basics of managing an accessible website. This involves gathering institutional support, how to select a vendor that can ensure accessibility. That sort of gets to Tammy's question. How to onboard other team members to accessibility. That gets to that question about convincing designers of accessibility. How to do content entry, and how to monitor accessibility over time. So all of your juicy questions, I'm sure you have in mind about, how do I, which plugin should I use? How do I write alt text? These questions and more will be answered next week. But this is what we learned today. This is where I say thank you. Hypothetically, if we were in person, you would applaud. Yay. Maybe you could say clap in the chat if you want. But I want to know what questions you have about anything we talked about. Oh, thank you, Jessica, for saying clap. Angela says, thank you, Fen, for an awesome presentation. I'm not exhausted yet. That's my secret. I was exhausted when we started. Chronic illness. Okay, I want to know what questions you have for me. We have like 7 minutes left. I meant to leave more time for questions, but that's okay. Someone raised their hand. Ooh, that's a feature. Madeline Elaine Walsh is raising their hand. I bet you have a question. Madeline, I'd love to hear your question. Or read it, I guess. I'll read it out loud so you'll all hear it. I have an update from Jessa, who is one of the lovely folks helping me out on the Clique side of things, that we are going to upload my slides in the handouts section. So, oh wait, no. Oh, you can upload the whole presentation. I think that's just as on the case of uploading slides for you. Okay. Someone said they're looking forward to part 2. I am too. Oh, Madeline says, never mind. I thought it was a clap. That's okay. Zach says, best plugins for accessibility on WordPress. Good question. And you've asked the right person. At Clique, one of our bread and butter is WordPress. So I have a few different answers for you. And I'm actually just going to look up a list that I have so that way I can give you a really good answer. One moment. Okay. So in general, if you're not doing a custom theme for WordPress, I would recommend making sure you're picking a theme that has accessibility features built in. In the WordPress like theme library, theme store, whatever it's called, you can filter themes by accessibility. So that's one. 2, there are specific plugins depending on, like, if you're trying to build specific elements that I would recommend. So for example, if you need a drop down or a select box and you need it to be accessible, there are specific plugins I'd recommend for that, which I can maybe send along a list if you want. But I'm assuming you mean in general, plugins to support accessibility in WordPress. I would recommend WP Accessibility. This adds in a bunch of features so you don't have to write them yourself, such as skip links, adding the language tags, all sorts of fiddly little specific things. It does it all for you, which is cool. WP Accessibility is my main one I would recommend. I'm looking through my list of what else. Yeah, honestly, that's my big one, is WP Accessibility. And I can even get you a list for next week, presuming you're coming along to next week. So sorry that my answer was a little vague, but I'll do some thinking for you. And Zach, if you have some good recommendations, I'd love to hear them too. Williams has so much to think about. I'm struggling with how to resource this and get it done. Oh, amen. That is a big problem. We can barely keep up on the basic content management on our site. Resources for foundation grants, etc., that can help provide money to small organizations with this would be of interest. Ooh, that is a question that I don't have an answer to, but that I would love an answer to. If anyone else has recommended resources for grants that help provide funding to small organizations, please put them in the chat. Let's help out William. I'm trying to think of other good recommendations I have off the top of my head for you. Depending on what, like, the nature of your organization, I would even recommend reaching out to different, like, web accessibility organizations in your area. My meetup that I help run in Chicago, we will occasionally have just nonprofits and such reach out to us saying, hey, we're trying to make our website more accessible. We don't have the resources. Do you have recommendations? Because we're also a not-for-profit. And we will either connect them with, sometimes people who are looking to volunteer their accessibility skills and just kind of looking to give back and help out nonprofits. We'll sometimes connect them with other free resources we know about, but that's very regional based. So I would recommend, if presuming you're in Denver, Denver actually has a digital accessibility meetup. Ooh. If they're here, don't yell at me for giving that recommendation, but you might reach out to accessibility professionals in your area specifically, and they might have individuals they can hook you up with. I unfortunately don't know much about grants, but people have recommendations, they should look them up. Someone asked about having designers who have disabilities. I think you're asking about, is it discrimination to specifically hire people with disabilities? So, I mean, yes, that's not what I'm suggesting, though. In the same way that I would suggest you should have a diverse team. One, because there's a lot of economic reasons. Diverse teams have been shown in studies to perform significantly better and make more money. So, why wouldn't you want to have a diverse team? But also, you're legally required to have, if you have over 50 people in your organization, but to have like diversity amongst your employees. So more, I mean this as an additional compelling reason as to why you should make sure that you're not discriminating against people with disabilities in your employment practices, and you're not providing barriers to hiring people with disabilities. So yeah, like if you have nobody at your company that has a disability, something's wrong. Like something is wrong with your organization. I'm not saying people should have to identify as having a disability, but like, you should think about that. You should make sure you have diversity in your organization. PDFs on a website, I try to avoid them entirely. Is that a good rule, or are they accessible? Oh, good question. I also do recognize it's 1 o'clock, so I'm going to answer this one last question, and I think we have to wrap. PDFs are accessible if you author them accessibly. Adobe Reader has an accessibility automated tool built into it that will help you construct accessible PDFs. Ideally, though, if your information doesn't have to be in a PDF and it can just be a page on your website, that will generally be more accessible. But sometimes you need to have things in a PDF, and that's okay. I think your intuition to try to avoid them is good, though. I like that. People said it's recorded and will be available in the next few days. Excellent. Blah, blah, blah. Keep an eye out for grant opportunities offered by government and local foundations. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, and you said if you received CARES money, this could qualify as a way to engage customers in a new way. Perfect. Thank you so much for that insight. I'm so glad that you all have expertise. I don't. I didn't even think of that. I love that. Yeah. Engaging your customers with disabilities in different ways. You would know more than I do, but making your website more accessible is definitely engaging in a new way. Okay, unfortunately, that's about all the time I have. Next week, I think we will leave more Q&A time. Oh, NEA grants, you also say, are good options. I love it. So with that, if you have any questions or thoughts between now and next week, if you're joining us next week, feel free to ping me on Twitter at Sublime March. Feel free to, my slides are back at the beginning. Feel free to, I'm seeing, I think there's one more question in Q&A. Someone says, how about Wix? I unfortunately don't have Wix recommendations, but I can try to find some for next week. Yeah, thank you all again for coming. I super appreciate it. I'm excited to see you next week if you'll be joining us to talk about the nitty-gritty of accessibility. Yeah. I think with that, I will say thank you and end the webinar. I don't want to take up more of your time. Again, I appreciate you all for coming, and have an awesome day. We will have slides to you soon, and I will see you next week.